You are in a tail end How to Keep a Piece of the Action workshop. Thank you all so much for waking up early and getting here. It was tough for me, so I know it was tough for you. 8 a.m. session. My name is Jeff Armstrong. If I haven't met you before, I'm meeting you now. My business is Armstrong Capital. I come from West Hills, California, which is Southern California. And I've been doing this business for 13 years. My phone number is for the tape. You can give me a call at 800-845-3055. And my website, visit my website at www.armstrongcapital.com. Click on Note Brokers on the left-hand side, and there's a whole section there for consultants and brokers, free broker packets you can download and print out, all the articles I've written for the Cash Flow Journal are on there, and all kinds of good tips and things for new brokers. Tail ends, this is an advanced session. I may go a little fast. I'm not going to do it with the calculator, although it would be helpful, but all they gave me was 50 minutes. So maybe we should just dive right into it, and then if we have time, we'll take a few questions about it and try to make sure that you understand when you, as a consultant, can take a back end of a mortgage. What this is if a person is acceptable to taking a very low price, usually, on their note, there's a lot of times there's room on the back of a mortgage for you to keep it for yourself. We do not, it can't be done on every single deal. There are ways to do it otherwise, which is even a more advanced class, which is going to be given by Rick Jowers, I believe, a little bit later today. However, the way I'm going to present it is the way I've been doing it since I was shown, probably back since '95. And it's very easy to identify when you can take one, but you also have to know that not all funding sources allow you to take the back end of a mortgage. We can buy partials from sellers, say by the first 5 years or the next 5 years or the next 10 years of a note, and then that seller will be the back end or the tail end holder, which means after that period of time goes by, the seller is the one that will be collecting those payments again. We can put ourselves in the position of that seller. We can buy the entire note from the funding source, and we can sell buy the entire note from the seller and sell a part of it to the funding source so that we'll be the ones in that position of receiving those payments in the future. And here's how we do it. Woohoo, we're getting started. Woohoo. A couple of quick things, though. I mentioned this yesterday in my session. Let me just mention it today as well. My opinion, being in this business for 13 years, being a master consultant, being someone that can help you guys along or wants to help you guys along, these are the items that I believe you need to be successful on the private mortgage note side of the business. Calculator skills, practicing in the back of your workbook. The more worksheets you go through and the more times you practice, filling out your 5 buckets and solving for those answers, the better you're going to get at the calculator. People skills, building that rapport, negotiating, especially on that first contact. Product knowledge, knowing the different ways to buy notes. Too many consultants go out there and they immediately try to just buy full purchases from our note holders. Okay, that'll be a long, boring road for you, and you may not be as successful as if you did more partial options. Okay, I'm a big proponent of pushing the partial. I'd rather do a partial with a note holder than doing a full purchase, unless I can take the back end. Okay, which I'll show you in just a second here. Persistence, you have to know that this works. Seeing 4,000 people here this weekend is a good positive, a good reinforcement of that. This business does work. You just have to figure out how it's going to work for you, what marketing methods to use, and keep that burning desire inside of you, and calling for help, your master brokers and your member advisors when you need help. So what is a tail end? A tail end is the back end of a note, also referred to as a remainderment and a back end. By taking the tail end of a note, you are creating an equity position in the deal. You are purchasing the entire note from the seller and selling a partial to the investor. You will make money at the time the transaction is closed, and you have the possibility of making more money when the tail end pays off or comes back to you. And keep in mind, when we're doing this, we're not using a dime of our own money. The funding sources that I work with, Western United Life, formerly Metropolitan Mortgage, Diversified Investments, Tracy Z, will do this for you. You will have the opportunity at certain times to not only take the tail end, the funding sources do all the work. They prepare all the documents for us, and without a dime of our own pocket, we have a tail end, a mortgage coming to us in the future. When can you take a tail end? Well, very simply, and there are other times, which would again be a whole other class, but when we can recognize that you can take a tail end whenever the investor is making a purchase based on their investment to value guidelines. Investment to value guidelines, if you remember from class, is investment to value. The funding source's investment, the funding source's purchase price versus the value of the collateral. So when a funding source gives us a purchase price based on their ITV limits, okay, and also remember the ITV limit is their maximum ceiling, the maximum amount they'll pay on that type of property. Some common ITV ratios are single-family homes, 80%, commercial properties, 70%, improved land, 70%, raw land, 55%. They don't want to put any more in those types of properties than their maximum ceiling on those properties. So when they're buying a note on them, or if we come into a problem and they pick a new ITV ratio, that's the opportunity to take a tail end. And there are times where they won't let you do it, but most of the time, they're making their yield, they're happy, and they will allow you to do it. So again, you can take a tail end whenever the funding source's purchase price is based on an ITV ratio. And how can you recognize that? Well, after you get the quote back, you faxed over your worksheet, and you obtained your offer from the funding source, you're going to plug the numbers in your calculator and figure out how they came up with that number. Was it by yield, or was it by a maximum ceiling? If it's an even number, it's probably an ITV ratio. Okay, that's your first clue to it. If they give you an even number for the full purchase price, it's probably based on an ITV ratio. Well, the easiest way to talk about it is just to give you some examples here. You have your handouts there that have the same examples up here on the screen. We'll just take them step by step and see if we can all be on the same page here. Raise your hands if you have any questions as we go along as well. This first example, these are all tail ends, back ends that I've taken back. I had built up in my career, at one point I had 137 tail ends. When we purchased our house in '99, I sold a whole bunch of them to get a large down payment because I was the note holder then. When you have a tail end, you're the note holder. You can sell those at any time you want to the funding source as well. So I sold a whole bunch of them to get a nice down payment on our house, and I'm slowly building them back up to the point where it's going to be a nice retirement for me. On some of these, you'll see they're coming back way in the future. Some of them are coming back sooner than others, but it's nice to have something in the future. So on this one, single-family home, San Antonio, Texas. It sold for $76,000, down payment $1,000, first trustee $75,000. When this seller called me to sell his note, there 18 payments had been paid, and there were 342 payments remaining at an interest rate of 9%. The first thing that we do when we're putting it in the calculator is we solve for verify the payment amount and get the current balance. So at the time that we purchased this note, the balance on the note was $74,213.65. At the time we purchased the note, the funding source's yield requirement on this particular deal was 12.25. which gave us a purchase price of $57,282.16. Okay, everyone's with me so far? Okay, this is just starting the transaction, faxed over the worksheet. I got the offer back of $57,282.16, and went back to the seller. On that one, I believe the seller initially accepted $55,000. Started the transaction, got the copies of the documents, sent them to the funding source. First thing the funding source does is check the credit. Well, we had a problem, or as I like to call it, we had a little adventure. Okay? There are many, many adventures in our job, in being a consultant and being a note broker. And the thing about being a consultant and the thing about our funding sources is we are very solutions oriented. We want to make it work. They don't make money, we don't make money unless that deal closes, and they're going to do everything they can to give us every opportunity to get that to close. So we had a problem. The first problem on this one was very poor credit. Initially, their purchase price was based on their yield requirement, the 12.25%. However, with the poor credit, they didn't want to get into the property any more than 60% of the value of the property. So they cut it, or they lowered their pay price for the full purchase to a maximum of $45,600, which was 60% of the sales price. Okay, you guys following along okay? So at 60% of the sales price, their purchase price now is $45,600. Since they still require, and here's where we're starting to take the back end for ourselves, since they still require a 12.25% yield, their yield didn't go up, they're just, the level of their risk as far as their investment to value went down. So the yield's still the same, 12.25%. You plug it in your calculator, and you have to do this. Okay? You plug in their maximum ITV, which is $45,600. You plug in their yield that they were using previously, and you solve for the number of months that value is worth. And in this case, it was for 145.29 payments, or 146 payments. So, when we get to that point, oh, here it is. I wrote a little note to, this case it was Western United Life Assurance, wrote a little note to Western, I will buy the full purchase from the seller for $44,000 and sell Western, the investor in this particular case, 146 payments. I will receive $1,600 now and 196 payments on the back end. It took some negotiating and talking to the seller. The seller really had a need. Okay? The only time we can really do deals anyway is when they have a need. He really had a need, so he took an additional $11,000 discount. Initially he accepted $55,000, now he accepted $44,000. Okay? I also gave him some partial options and whatever, but he wanted to sell the whole note and get the most money out of it that he could at that time. So in my negotiations, he accepted $44,000. So now I'm receiving actually less money up front, but I'm still doing the deal, and I'm going to get the tail end of this note, the back end of this note. When we calculate it out, the next step I did for myself was to figure out, okay, if the funding source purchases 146 payments, if it pays off the next day, the next week after we do this transaction, how much is actually owed to the funding source and how much is actually owed to me? The way we did that is we calculate out at the note rate on this one was 9%. At the note rate, 146 payments is equal to a present balance of $53,434.24 that is due to the funding source. Okay, they're buying 146 payments for $45,600, and they're paying $45,600 for the right to receive $53,434 of that principal balance. Okay, so they're paying $45,600 for the right to receive $53,434. If it were to pay off the next day, the next week, after they did this transaction, that's how much they would be owed. Okay, and as now the back-end holder of the note, I would be owed the remaining amount. The balance on the note at that time was $74,213. The funding source is owed $53,434.24. And I took an equity position in that note now of $20,779.41. Every payment that goes by, that the investor collects, what's owed to them goes down to zero over those 146 months, and what's owed to me goes all the way up to the balance of the note at the time I get it back. What are my 196 payments worth when I get it back in March 10th of 2008? Well, 196 payments, note rate's going to be 9%. There'll be 196 payments remaining at that time. This was initially a 30-year note. The balance at that time, after 146 months goes by, will be $61,860.18. Okay? As far as accounting and everything, I made my $1,600 on the deal. That's what I report. I didn't receive anything from this yet. It's still out there. I'm still waiting to get it. There's nothing to report yet. Okay? It's just sitting there building up for retirement. Or 2008, that's in a few years. One of my daughters will be in college. Might cash it out myself and use it for that. I might feel a little need for another boat or something. Okay? But that's my money now. That is my note now. I can call up the funding source and say, how much you give me for another 60 payments? How much you give me for the rest of the note? It's my note now. Okay, so I took it. Western United is great at allowing us to do this. They prepare the documents from Armstrong Capital, from the seller to Armstrong Capital for the full purchase for $44,000. They prepare the documents from Armstrong Capital selling 146 payments to Western United Life. Okay, I took the difference for $45,600. I took the difference of $1,600, and that note is my note now on the back end. Okay? Shailene, if you want to walk around, I do have a couple books out, and I will be giving one of each away here. If you want to put your cards in my hat, my Armstrong Capital hat, I will choose one at the end, two at the end, and hand out my books.
Jeff, I have a
Question?
Does a seller, when he finds out that the buyer has got really bad credit, does the seller ever go back to the buyer and say, because of your bad credit, I'm losing out $20,000?
Okay. When the seller finds out that the payor has really bad credit, does the seller ever go back to the payor and say, because of your darn bad credit, my note's worth $20,000 less? If they do, I haven't heard it. You know, you have to look at it. It was the seller's fault that they didn't look at the credit in the first place. Okay, or maybe they did and they felt sorry for him, or for whatever reason they just wanted to sell their property and they took whatever they could get at the time. So there comes a point where the seller has a certain responsibility to himself, not only on credit, but on the next example you'll see some sellers don't even bother to check the value of the property when they sell it. So we end up getting low appraisals, and that affects the value of the note as well. Carolyn.
But you also have the possibility that they were good with their credit and then somebody lost their job.
Sure. That's always a possibility. They might have had good credit when they purchased, and this note had 18 months seasoning on it. You know, so they might have had good credit at the time they sold it, and for some unfortunate event might have happened, and the credit might have gotten worse as time went by. Okay. 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 When as a consultant wanting to take the back end, do I ever look at the credit myself, or am I ever concerned about the credit? I'm really not. I'm not concerned because, number one, this is free money for me, okay? And I'm putting out not a dime of my own money is going into this transaction. This is free money for me. This is free. They're giving me a mortgage, basically. So what happens is I could care less about the credit. Look at this. I have a note that if it does get to the point of 2008, it'll come back to me and I'll have a windfall. So it doesn't concern me about the credit. I just know I have another tail end in my portfolio now. Two things can happen. Same with when a seller sells a partial and they have the back end, or when you as a consultant take a partial, take the back end yourself. Two things can happen during that period of time that we're waiting for it to come back to us. Number one, they can pay off. In the event of a payoff, we're going to get a surprise lump sum check in the mail, and we're going to be jumping up and down. Okay? Whatever amount it is, it is. Just 2 months ago, I got a nice surprise check in the mail on a back end that paid off for $15,800. Just opened it. Oh, who's this from? Whoo! There you go. Nice surprises come up. The second thing that can happen as we're waiting for our back end to come back to us is that it can go into default. Okay, and I'm going to have the same two options that sellers have when they sell a partial. The first option is going to be buy it back, pay off the funding source, buy it back from the funding source, and foreclose myself, of which I have no interest in doing, foreclosing on a property in San Antonio, Texas. Okay, or two, sit back, wait, let the funding source foreclose, take back the note, take back the property, fix it up, resell it, and if there's any cash left over, I'll get the rest of it. Okay, the reality is there's not always a lot of cash left over in the end of it. Okay, but it's just gravy for me. I'm not going to sweat about it until I'm actually receiving payments. Okay, it's a bummer if it doesn't come through and it does go into foreclosure, that I'm not probably going to get any money out of it, but that's, I guess, the risk I'm taking for, again, no money of my own. Okay? If it comes in, it's great, it's gravy. If not, I made my $1,600 on a transaction. I'm as happy as I can be losing out on an opportunity to get $60,000 in the future. Yes?
When you put the full victory money for the seller, is he aware that you're taking the back end?
When we're doing the closing, is the seller aware that I'm taking the back end? No, all the seller sees is that he is selling his entire note to Armstrong Capital. That's all he sees. Okay, so he has no idea. He knows he's getting $44,000 for the entire note, and that's all he sees. Absolutely. When you're doing this with a funding source, you've got to write them that little note. I will buy the full from the seller for X amount of money and sell the funding source, Western United, the 146 payments in this case. Okay, so there will be a point where you will have to put that in writing. Okay, and then they will do the rest after that. Okay?
You physically endorse the note over non-recourse?
Yes, I will sign the same documents. Do I physically endorse the note over was the question. I will sign the same documents that any seller would sign. I sign a purchase agreement. I sign an assignment of deed of trust or assignment of mortgage. I do a note endorsement because it gets endorsed over to me, and then I then have to endorse it over to the funding source. And it all happens at the same time. When I get the note back, the payments will come directly from the original buyer. So at the end of it all, after these 146 months go by, a goodbye letter will be sent from the funding source to the payor. Now you make your payments to Armstrong Capital. Yes? Who's paying for the due diligence and the closing costs on the initial transaction? Well, if you did wholesale with the funding source, it's going to come out of your commission. Okay, but not the seller. I personally never pass on costs to the seller. Okay. Let's look at another one while we have some more time here. It's a smaller one. Example number 2. This was 1.6 acres of improved land in Middleburg, Florida. It sold for $22,500. And at the time the transaction happened, 5 payments had been paid. It was a 20-year note, and there were 235 payments remaining at an interest rate of 10%. When we started the transaction, the balance on the note was $19,866 on a piece of improved land. At that time in 1997, the funding source's yield requirement was 14.25. So they had an initial purchase price, full purchase price on this one of $15,238. Again, the problem on this one was poor credit. The adventure on this one was poor credit. Poor credit, the investor cut his purchase price down to that 60% ITV level, 60% investment to value level. So their maximum pay price was now only $13,500 versus a previous pay price of $15,200. So again, I had to go back and negotiate with the seller a lower full purchase price. Again, this guy needed money, as most of our sellers do, and he accepted it. The funding source then gave me a purchase price of 60% of the sales price of the value of the property. $22,500 times 60% is a purchase price of $13,500. We calculated out how many payments the funding source would have to purchase for that. Again, this is something that I did on my calculator before I went back to the funding source. I plugged in their yield of 14.25, working it backwards, solving for the number of payments. In this case, and back then, they had a minimum discount off of a note. Since this was a small note, they had a minimum discount on it, and the minimum discount made their yield go up just slightly, and the payments that they're going to be owed went up to 160. That's kind of a whole other course, so let's just accept that right now. Okay? When they did that, I went back to the seller, and I was able to get him to accept $13,000 for the full purchase of his note. Because it was based on, their price now was based on an investment to value ceiling, in this case 60%. I went back to the seller, got him to accept $13,000, and I set it up that way. I wrote a little note now to the funding source saying that Armstrong Capital will buy the full from the seller for $13,000 and sell, in this case again, Western United, 160 payments. I will receive $500 now and 75 payments on the back end of this note. I will put myself in the position of the note holder. When we did this transaction, how much was the funding source owed? Plugging in our calculators, with the note rate, the funding source is purchasing 160 payments, so they're paying $13,500 for the right to receive $17,021.65. Okay, that's what their 160 payments is worth. If that note were to get paid off the next day after we did this transaction, the funding source would be owed $17,021.65. How much would I be owed after this, when this transaction started? You subtract what the funding source is owed from the balance of the note, $19,866, less the $17,021 the funding source is owed, and my back end, tail end on this one started out being worth $2,844.45. Not as dramatic as the first example, however, it's just future free money. Okay, it's mine now. When this note comes back to me in May 15th of 2011, what is the balance of the note? What is that payor, that buyer of that property, going to owe me in 2011? There were 235 payments remaining when we bought the note. The funding source purchased 160 of them, which left 75 payments on the back end, on the tail end for me. At that point in time, the buyer of that property will owe me $10,731.20. And I will be owed 75 payments, over 6 years of payments. Okay. A smaller note, however, I'll take back any tail ends whenever I can get them. 6 payments on the back end, 12 payments on the back end, a piece of a balloon on the back end, things like that. You just put yourself in a position to get money in the future, to get that residual income. All those factoring guys over there are talking about there's no residual in mortgages. Well, they never talk to me. Fred Steinberg and I go at it all the time. There was a question over here. Exactly. Obviously on this one, there were some costs. I only had an appraisal cost on this one since the seller already had title insurance. So this was a wholesale price. And I probably ended up with maybe about $300 instead of $500. But hey, I got the tail end on this one. I can turn around still at any point in time now and sell the rest of this note to the original funding source. It's my note now. It's just sitting there waiting for me to collect. Correct. Yeah, the funding source will not tell you you're going to have to discover this and tell them this on your own. Okay, they're not going to say, hey, look, you can make more money. They'll just be very happy to get a much better yield if you're able to get them to accept the price. I did not learn of this. Someone told me, about 4 years into my business. I was kicking myself for not knowing this beforehand, and I thought I'd share that with you guys too. When I teach classes, I try to share it with you too, so you can at least recognize when the opportunity does come up. And your second question?
The second question is on the yields that they expect. How do you know what yields they are expecting?
Right. How do we know what yields they expect to get? Well, on their initial offer to me, what I always did was I would go back once I obtained the offer from the funding source, plug the numbers in my calculator, and solve for yield. And see how much they do. That's how you kind of learn, what they're looking for. You go into it backwards and figure it out. So that's how I got the 14.25s and the 12.25s. Okay, and you could always ask them as well. Yes, the yield did go up, as you saw, to 14.72. Well, they just want less risk, not more profit. Just less risk. They lowered their initial purchase price, and now if they did buy the full purchase, their yield would skyrocket. But since I calculated it out so that they would just buy a partial now, they're still getting very close to that same yield. Well, initially, if you look a little farther up on the page, initially they offered $15,000 something for the note. Okay, that was their initial offer, and that's why I went in and figured out their yield, and that's the yield I was basing it on. Okay, Carolyn.
How much will you put into making sure that this is a good, for instance, how much due diligence?
For myself?
Yes, is there flood insurance?
Okay. How much due diligence would I as a consultant do to figure out if this is a good note? I will not do any, okay? Really. The funding source does it all. If they think it's a good note to buy at that price, that's fine. Again, this is just gravy for me. This will come in the future, and I do no other extra checks to verify. Because if it comes in, it comes in. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Okay? Over here, there are a couple hands, too. Sure, exactly. If this paid off just a couple months after it started, I would get somewhere north of $2,800. Okay, every payment that goes by, I'm owed more, and the funding source is owed less. I'm owed $2,844 right after the end of this transaction happens, okay? And after 160 payments, my $2,800 goes all the way up to $10,700. And the funding source is $17,000, goes all the way down to zero. Okay, it's a little reverse amortization for them.
Jeff, you said in the beginning that there's only a few funding sources that do this. Maybe Western United, First Site. What about the ones that don't? Do they say, hey, I paid for the full note? And are these that are letting you do the tail end kind of in a generous situation? I mean,
Well-
it looks like they buy the full note.
well,
Why would they take it?
Right. Why doesn't every funding source do this? Well, some funding sources only buy full purchases, and they don't buy partials. Okay, note 1, Interbay, only buy full purchases, whole notes. So if they can't buy a partial, they can't give you a back end. Okay? If they have to buy a partial, because they're buying a partial, they're buying 160 payments. A note 1 or an Interbay can't just buy a partial, so you can't do a back end with them. Okay? So the funding sources that purchase partials are the ones where you can make this happen. Okay? A couple more, and then we'll do the last example.
I have a different question. So initially they offer, like $15,000 for the full note, then they always get back credit. If you only want to pay $13,000, then you come back over, you only get half the payment. Is there any friction with the buyer?
No. The partial purchase funding sources, okay, they also purchase full purchases, but they also buy partials. The partial purchase funding sources, I have never had, let me just put it this way then, I have never had any friction between the funding source and myself about, whether or not I'm going to take the back end. Okay, as long as they get their yield that they're looking for, they're happy. Exactly. Now there are times where they'll say, you know what, Jeff, this one, we're not going to let you take the back end. Okay, no, don't fight with them, because you can. But just, save it for the next one. There are times when, they might be having a bad hair day, or, it might be raining up there in Seattle, or, whatever it is. Okay? But just recognize that you might be able to take the back end. And that's why I say the word might, because the funding source does have to allow you to do it. But most of the time, they want you to do it so that you remember and you'll bring them more deals. Okay? Well, on all these examples I'm giving you, I had already faxed over a worksheet to the funding sources and received a price for the note. Okay? Usually, the only times that I'm able to take the tail end is after the fact, after someone has said yes, after we got copies of all the documents already, and then they start doing their due diligence. On the next example, you'll see it wasn't because of poor credit, it was because of a different reason why I got the back end. Okay? So let's go to that third example while we still have a few minutes left here. Now this is just a whopping, wonderful example, and I really just put it here for the wow effect, because wow, what a great back end this is for me. This lady sold her property for $89,900, $2,000 down, $87,900 first. When we purchased this note, 2 payments had been paid, and there were 497 payments remaining. That is just a little over 41 years. Okay, so initially on this note, it was a long term anyway, and a big, huge discount besides the fact. Interest rate is 7.5%. The story was that she inherited this property from her father. The payor, the person that bought the property, the girl that bought the property, was the renter in the property for many, many years. She was paying $575 a month, and that's where they wanted to keep the payments at. So that's why we ended up with 41 years of payments. At the time we purchased the note, the balance on the note after 2 payments had gone by was $87,841. The funding source on this particular one wanted a 12% yield, and their purchase price initially was $57,090. Not being too greedy or anything, she had accepted $55,000. We started the transaction. The credit was fine. We went to the next phase of due diligence, which was the appraisal, and the appraisal came in for $60,000. She sold it for almost $90,000, and we got a value of $60,000. A lot of sellers just pick a number, and a buyer says, okay, and they buy it. No one ever checks what the real value of the property is. This happens more often than we'd like on our side of the business. But had she gone to a real estate agent and said, hey, how much would you list this property for? She could have found out something much closer to what the actual value was. So initially, when I told her this news that the property was only worth $60,000 and she sold it for $90,000, she was a little put off. She thought maybe I was trying to smoke her or get something out of it that was more than what was due to me. So I got a copy of the appraisal and I sent it to her, and 2 weeks go by and she finally said, okay, I believe you. You're not lying to me. I understand it is only worth $60,000. Well, then I had to get over another hurdle with the funding source. Normally, when the value of the property is less than the balance of the note, the funding source cancel it immediately. They just, no thank you, we don't want to be in a situation like that. Being the person I am, I went back to the funding source and said, hey, can you give me some help here? I know this person really wants to sell a property. I know that she just wants to get out of it. Every time she gets a check from the payor, she does not, she gets memories of her father and she doesn't want to keep this note. She wants to sell it. Can you do anything for me? Well, Mark Donahue at that time was the vice president of Metropolitan Mortgage, and he's the guy I talked to. And he said, okay, Jeff, well, we'll do this. We'll go in at a 50% ITV on this property, and we'll pay $30,000. That's the most we'll put into this property. I understand I got about 3 minutes left, so I'll speed this up here. At that time, I went into it backwards again. I calculated out that if they paid $30,000 for this note, and the yield after the fact, they wanted a 17% yield. We had to negotiate that between myself and the funding source. At first they came back and they would have received a 23% yield. And I went back to Mark and said, Mark, wow, you were only getting 12 in the first place. Can you meet me somewhere in the middle? He knew what I was trying to do. He allowed me to do it. He gave me a 17% yield. We plugged that in the calculator and we end up with 8 years of payments, about 96 payments. So I wrote a little note to Mark over at Western United and said, hey, Armstrong Capital will buy the full purchase from the seller for $27,000. I got back to her, I explained it all to her, gave her several different options. She wanted to sell the whole thing. She accepted $27,000 for an $87,000 note. I'm trying to speed up here, I'm sorry. The balance of that, so Armstrong Capital bought the full purchase from the seller for $27,000 and sold the investor 96 payments. I received $3,000 at the time of the closing, and now 401 payments on the back end of that note. That tail end of that note is now mine. At the time that this transaction started, the funding source paid $30,000 for the right to receive $41,414. If we take that away from the balance of the note at that time, my 401 payments remaining, I hope that's correct on yours. This is 401 payments right here. 401. 401 payments on the back end of the note were worth $46,426. I made my $3,000. When that note comes back to me in 8 years, the payor on that note will still owe me $84,000. Okay? Initially, I would have received $46,426 after the sale of that note, and after those 8 years go by, it will go all the way up to $84,436. I've got to close it out now. My time is up. Let me do a couple things. Thank you very much for getting up early and coming to my session. I'll be outside for questions after. Let me pick a couple names out of the hat here and give away a couple of these books. And the first winner is, turn off my mic.
This concludes this presentation.